The United Nations and Cambodia's courts established the Extraordinary Chambers of the Courts in Cambodia, ECCC, in 2003, more than 4 decades after Vietnam occupies Cambodia and quashed the brutal Khmer Rouge regime. International authorities tasked the ECCC with bringing to justice the Khmer Rouge leaders more responsible for crimes committed from 1975 to 1979, crimes that resulted in the death of 1.7 million people. Now, after 16 years, the big question is, has the hybrid court, co-funded by the UN, been worth the more than $300 million spent? Beyond achieving some measure of justice for the victims of Khmer Rouge, what are the tribunal's legacy and lessons for Cambodia and the international community? To answer these questions, VOA Vathana Seourn interviewed Nicholas Koumjian, who served as an international co-prosecutor with the ECCC from 2013 to 2019. The interview took place in early August in Washington, D.C.
Hello, Mr. Koumjian.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Mr. Nicholas Koumjian is a former international co-prosecutor at Extraordinary Chambers of the Courts in Cambodia, who practiced law for more than 35 years, including almost 20 years of experience in the fields of international criminal justice. Mr. Koumjian, first of all, Khmer Rouge Tribunal is a challenging process. So could you please tell us what brought you in and remains there for almost 6 years?
Well, thank you. Well, I was appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations and then approved by the Council of Magistracy for Cambodia. For me, it was an opportunity to participate in cases that I saw at the time, and I continue to see as the most important criminal process since the Second World War, since the Nuremberg trials. Certainly in terms of the number of victims that were affected by the crimes. So in the Cambodian situation, as you know, the best estimates of demographers are something like 1.9 million persons lost their lives during that regime. But it really wasn't only those who were killed that were affected. Anyone who's over 40 years old or anyone who's old enough to have memories of that regime went through terrible suffering of different sorts, but the great majority of the population was forced into working under conditions of enslavement. Thousands were forced into marriages against their will. And this had a tremendous effect on Cambodia at the time, but of course it still does. Those persons still have their memories. It undoubtedly affects the relations with their children, even with their grandchildren. And I think it's critical in the case of seeking a justice process that not only is it important to show that those who are responsible for such serious crimes will face justice and be held to account, no matter how much time has passed, but also for the memory of a society like Cambodia, that those who were too young to remember what happened understand the history of their land, understand what their parents and grandparents went through, with the main objective being that this never happens anywhere again.
Since you left the office in June 2019, is there anyone replaced you yet?
Yes, when I was the prosecutor, there was a reserve international co-prosecutor, Brenda Hollis. So she has now taken over my duties. She is now acting as the reserve international co-prosecutor, and she will eventually be in Cambodia and fully acting in place of me.
At this point, what has the Extraordinary Chambers of the Courts in Cambodia, or ECCC, has been done?
Well, the court has done a limited number of cases. There's no doubt about that. But you know that we had the first trial was Doi, the commander of S-21. He was sentenced to life imprisonment following his appeal. Then there was a case filed against the very senior leadership, which included at the start of the trial Nunchea, who was known as brother number 2 during the regime, Kyu Sampan, who was the head of state, and also the foreign minister Ieng Sary and his wife Ieng Tharit, who was the Minister of Social Affairs. Now, in the course of the proceedings, Ieng Tharit died she was found incompetent to stand trial, so she was never part of the trial. Ieng Sary died well into the first trial. But let me explain that because that trial was so massive, it involved things that happened all around the country, and the great challenge of linking these crimes that happened in villages to the very top leadership. It took a long time, and the judges decided, particularly because of the ages of the accused, that they would sever the charges. So in the first trial, which involved Nunche Kusampan and Ieng Sary, it dealt mainly with the evacuation of Phnom Penh and also with a transfer of the population to the northwest that began later that year in 1975. And it dealt with the crimes associated with that. Eventually, Ieng Sary died before the trial was completed, but Nunche and Kusampan were convicted of various crimes against humanity in that trial, including forced deportations, including murder, including exterminations. They were then went on appeal, and their life sentences were upheld on appeal. But that still left the great majority of the crimes that had affected millions of Cambodians not yet dealt with. So we pushed very hard to have a second trial that would deal with charges that were representative of what really happened in Cambodia. So that would include forced marriages, the thousands of couples across Cambodia that were forced to marry, and in most cases forced to consummate that marriage, which we say is the equivalent of rape and amounted to a crime against humanity. It also dealt with the security centers where so many thousands were tortured and killed. We believe now, based on, we're continuing to study the records recovered from S-21, there are hundreds of thousands of pages to go through, but we believe now that about 18,000 individuals were killed just at that institution, S-21, Tulslang, and taken to the killing fields and killed. And we also dealt with other securities, including Krang Tachan in Tram Kak district. The case also dealt with the genocide of certain minority groups, that is the Vietnamese and the Chan Muslims. We argued, and the judges found during the trial, in the trial judgment, that there was an intent to destroy those groups in Cambodia. And in the crime that really affected almost everyone, so in many ways the most important crime, they found again that there was enslavement of the population, that the Khmer Rouge, the enslavement is a crime against humanity under international law when it's proven that human beings are treated by others with the indicia of ownership, that they act as if they own the person.
I see.
Denying fundamental rights. So that was, I think, one of the fundamental basis of how the Khmer Rouge treated Cambodian society. Except for the top cadres, all the rest were used for the purposes of furthering the goals of these top cadres in the party. So that would include killing them if they were no longer useful. There was the famous slogan that we heard from so many that they heard during the regime: to keep you is no gain, to lose you is no loss. And this is how they justified the killings. The human beings didn't matter for anything. There was no law, there was no rule of law. And this is, I think, fundamental for any society, that there is a rule of law. That it's not up to leaders or a party to decide this person is against the interests of our country as a security threat and kill them with no legal process, or even imprison them, certainly not to torture them. So we hope that this example, although we only were able to try a few individuals, there's still some other cases in an investigation stage, but even if it's only a few individuals, it's an important, it's a very important accomplishment, and something that I think is important both for Cambodian society, but for the whole world. And that is why when the court was set up, it wasn't just the Cambodian government, Both co-prime ministers requested that the United Nations, help establish the court. But there was tremendous interest from the international community, from other states, because what happens in one country can set a precedent for others. And if the world let the terrible crimes of the Khmer Rouge go unpunished, it would set a terrible example for others around the world.
I see.
So I feel it was a privilege to be part of this process.
I see. Due to the fact, or as you mentioned earlier, that the trial took a long time, and it cost almost $300 million and only 3 convictions, there's a widespread criticism regarding the court spending too much resource, but little has it done. What do you think about it?
Well, I've worked at other international courts, and unfortunately, international justice is complicated and it's expensive. The budget for the International Criminal Court, I think, is about $200 million a year, or perhaps a little more, and that was about the budget per year of the Yugoslav Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal. Those cost billions of dollars together. So in the case of the Cambodia court, certainly I tried to do when I was there, whatever we could to make the process more efficient and to speed it up. But as I said, to link a top leader to crimes, thousands or hundreds of thousands of crimes all around the country, crimes that happened in a village. Perhaps a couple was forced to marry and forced to have sex, raped by the regime, or someone was tortured in a village. To show that that victim, who the top leaders never met, who was forced to marry by a village chief that the top leaders never talked to show why the top leaders like Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan were responsible for that crime is complicated, and it takes a lot of evidence. That's why we had well over 50,000 pages of trial transcript and hundreds of thousands of pages of documentary evidence. It's a complicated process, but also, if you look at it in another way, $300 million for crimes that happened against 8 million people means, if my math is right, it's a little less than $40 per person. If you just use those killed, it would be $150 for each of those killed. I certainly think it's worth for the memory of those people, and also because it really is something that serves victims around the world, that this kind of process is pursued.
Now the tribunal is like preparing to close its operations. What do you think should happen to individuals such as Sumet, Mies Mut, Yumtet, Aum An, and Jam, who were charged, but then the court decided not to proceed the indictments?
Well, that's not actually correct. There's in the case of Cham, you're correct that that case is over, that the co-investigating judges believe that she did not fit the personal jurisdiction requirements of the court, which was that on the agreement between the United Nations and the government of Cambodia, the agreement was that this court would try only those who were among those most responsible, either senior leaders or among those most responsible for the crimes of the regime. It was always envisioned that there would be a limited number of persons, and both of the co-investigating judges agreed with my national co-prosecutor that she did not qualify as among those most responsible. But as for the other 3 cases you mentioned that are they're still ongoing. They're currently before the pretrial chamber. That is Al An, who was the sector chief in Sector 41. That was a sector where many thousands, particularly of Cham, were killed, and we say on his direct orders. There's also the case against Mies Mut, who was part of the top military command and controlled the area around Sihanoukville, and also against Yim Tit, who was a top leader and controlled major areas in the northwest of the regime. Those cases are all currently in the process of going before the pretrial chamber. I'm not going to speak more about them because they are matters currently before the court, and ethically I shouldn't be commenting to the press about matters that are to be presented before the court. But your listeners and your viewers should know that those cases are still in process.
In case those people would walk for free, would walk freely after the ECCC is closed, it is stated that the efforts of making the young generations know their names and know what they did is kind of a form of justice. What do you think about this statement?
I think the transparency of the process is very important. You know, I talked a little bit about the importance of educating the young people, particularly in Cambodia, about what happened. And it's not just young people. I think it's very important to make the records of the court as accessible as possible to ordinary people, but also to scholars that are still researching what happened in the Khmer Rouge period. I think one very important result of the litigation we had in the case of Im Cham, although the pretrial chamber did not agree with my position that she was among the most responsible, they did agree when we appealed the fact that originally the closing order of the co-investigating judges was heavily redacted. About 2/3 was going to remain confidential forever. And we appealed that, and unanimously, the pretrial chamber judges agreed with us. And now there is a very transparent version available to the public. Anyone who wants to can read that, all about what the judges felt about the case, the evidence that the prosecution argued, the arguments of the defense. So I think this is very important that the court remain as transparent as possible.
And what is the exit strategies of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal?
Well, I mean, the court is still not yet sure whether there's going to be another trial or not, because that's going to be up to the pretrial chamber, and that litigation is still ongoing. But I think certainly the basic thought is that whenever the court does close, it will be important to, again, make its records as accessible as possible to the population. You know, one project that was very important to me that the co-prosecution continues to work on, the co-prosecutors, both national and international, is a project to try to get the best list we can of those who suffered, who were victims at S21. It's very, very complicated because we have all kinds of lists. Some are lists of people killed one day, some are lists of people in a room one day, some are lists of people who entered, and some are handwritten, some are typed. How they're spelling, it's very difficult to determine if this is a name of a different person or the same person. But you know, we've had grants from other governments. The Irish government gave us a grant, and now from UNESCO. And we're working on that to try to get the best list possible so that a young Cambodian can say, you know, I heard my grandfather disappeared. What happened to him? Would be able to eventually go online, run his name, and see the records about what happened if his grandfather was at S21, what happened to them there. From the Cambodian victims that I talked to, I think that's very, very important. People want to know what happened. It's terrible to lose a family member, but to just have a family member disappear and never know for sure what happened to them, I think it's even more painful. So we want to try to do what we can to help people find out what happened to their families.
Justice is subjective, and what do you think of the forms of justice delivered by the court to the victims and the survivors of Khmer Rouge Tribunal? Regimes, I mean.
Well, I think, you know, ultimately it's for each victim to have their own opinion about whether they feel that justice was delivered. But I think that for many people that I've spoken to, this was a measure of justice, certainly not full justice. And it's not just really in Cambodia. I've been lucky enough, I've worked at tribunals involving horrible crimes, war crimes in Bosnia, in Sierra Leone, in Africa, in Cambodia, in Colombia. And what I have gotten from talking to victims and getting to know some very, very well is that what almost all of them share is a desire to tell their story and to know that people are listening to their story. And when they see an international tribunal of judges, some of them appointed by the United Nations and their nationals, listening to their story and then holding someone to account, saying what happened to you was a crime. And it wasn't just a crime that was an accident. It was because of a policy by this leader. They feel better. They feel a sense of satisfaction of having that recognition. So I think that is an important part of justice. And ultimately, they want to see someone held to account for the very serious crimes they suffered.
What do you think are the legacies of the tribunal?
Well, I think there's going to be debates about that for many, many years, and many academics are going to write about that. There certainly would be some lessons learned of how to do things better. But I think, some of the good parts, some of the successes of the tribunal is the fact that it was based in the country where the crimes happened. We had hundreds of thousands of Cambodians pass through the court and at least view parts of some proceedings and see how justice was ongoing. Because I think ideally, and I think the court contributed a little bit to this, of course you want the rule of law not just for war crimes, but in all ordinary cases too. And I think when you have an example in a country of a case of a court that's operating where defendants are listened to, where judges are independent, where they exercise their own opinions, and decisions are based on evidence after giving a fair opportunity for all sides to state their opinions. That's an example of the rule of law that hopefully will affect what happens in domestic courts also. I think when people see justice in action and fair courts, they want to demand it for their own courts, and they want to demand it for their own society. So I hope that's also a legacy of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. I think the most important thing is this horrible regime that treated human beings as simply pawns in their game, to kill if they wanted to torture if they wanted to, whatever was to the benefit of the leadership and their political goals. That's intolerable. That's against international law. And those that commit those kinds of crimes will eventually be held to account.
And what are the lessons learned you got from the ECCC?
Oh, there's so many, personal lessons learned, but I think there are lessons that will be applied in other courts as they're set up around the world. I think one of them is, the necessity to be really clear in the rules that you establish about what the rules will be, so that there's no ambiguity about procedures. The rules could have been clearer in Cambodia and the situation that we're currently facing. I think the importance of trying to reach out to victims and to the population to make the proceedings as transparent and as accessible to the population as possible. That's one of the lessons of the ECCC. And there's various lessons I think you could learn about making the proceedings as efficient as possible. Also, the ECCC was the first court where victims actually participated as parties. And there were some bumps in the road of that procedure because it's normal in French courts and Cambodian courts, but these cases normally deal with only a couple of victims. In the case of the Cambodian court, first they had the trial of Duek involving S21, and there were tens of thousands of victims. And then later, when you had case 2 dealing with the whole leadership, there were over 4,000 victims participating. So how do you manage that in a courtroom? And I think eventually the court worked that out where it was fairly pretty efficient, as efficiently as possible, where there was one lead lawyer working with other lawyers for the victims. So I think that is something that will be looked at by other courts, and I expect other courts will also adopt many of the procedures that did prove eventually to be successful at the ECCC.
Finally, is there anything you would like to add, Mr. Koumjian?
I would just say that the almost 6 years that I served in Cambodia were a privilege, and I really appreciate how the Cambodian people treated me, and I wish the court and the entire population of Cambodia as much success as possible in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being with us.